Instagram. Like this video, helps us out a lot. So in my series talking about brand and design, I'm going to talk about one particular model of jacket today, which is my Northlander jacket. For those of you who follow my brand, you know that I am an expert in the history of leather jackets, but my interest is about building jackets that could have been but never happened, right? And as you know from previous videos, I build the patterns from scratch for each model. And I really love my Northlander jacket. It's not currently on my website, but it's a really beautiful, beautiful design. So I thought I would give a little bit of the history of how I came up with this design. Okay, so we'll look at the jacket here. This is my Northlander. It's quite pretty. The back, it has a sort of like almost like a 3/4 length sort of style with the little tightening adjusters on the back. And then in the front, if you see this coat, which I will attempt to button up here, it has a sort of rounded 1930s, almost sort of Cossack style collar and two big yoke-y shaped front patch pockets, and then a really cool sort of teardrop shaped front pocket, right? This leather is particularly beautiful. This is an Italian steer hide that I had developed in oxblood color in Italy from a bag company. And we only have, I think we have a little bit more of this oxblood and some natural, and then we're done with this. This was you know, sort of a one-time deal. And this coat is really quite an amazing design. So what is interesting about the Northlander, besides the name? Coming from the North, Canada, woo, out about. It is a 30s design because it's a car coat. It's very tight proportionally to the body. It has a really nice shape that comes in around the waist. It has these sort of extra long cuffs that are with a sort of simple flap. And it has this sort of crazy rounded collar, you know. Originally I built it with a chin strap, so the collar sort of sews into this sort of chin strap piece that turns down, right? And it has this beautiful rounded pocket. Now, I conspired this design from 30s workwear. There were a lot of hunting jackets in the 30s, and some of those hunting jacket companies would actually make the jackets out of leather. So Abercrombie, or I can't remember historically which other jacket hunting jacket company made a sort of hunting jacket with a beautiful, and there was this brand called Eskimo with this beautiful chest pocket and then two big patch pockets, and then they would put a hunting flap, so if you were out in the wilds you could put stuff in the back of the coat. So I conspired a very tight fitting car coaty sort of shape with a sort of classic curved motorcycle sleeve and this big cuff from that 30s pattern. So that's how the Northlander came about. But what's interesting, and this is something I probably haven't talked about before, is, and the Intrepid, which is the reversible, FYI, reversible version of the Northlander. So same pattern, you know, named after the man called Intrepid, Carré, you know, but a reversible coat. And you can see that when you do it in corduroy, it comes off like this beautiful classic 30s sort of hunting jacket. So I used the same pattern for two coats because of that sort of hunting fitted quality. This is a real sort of Indiana Jones professor sort of style of coat. What's interesting about 30s is that in the 1970s, jackets and clothing started to emulate the cuts and the styles of the 1930s. So in the 30s, these jacket companies, they would hand cut and design and draw their patterns. And they were very intuitive patterns. So you know, someone would come into a little shop and they'd be like, I want a pair of pants. And there was no standard for making a pant pattern or a coat pattern. And so they would sort of drape things on you and draw a pattern, and you would be like, well, I want this style of coat. And then they would each company would have its own sort of signature pattern making dimensions and proportions technique based on who their pattern maker was. Well, in the 70s, with all these hippies that started opening little shops like East West Musical Instruments, where they would build musical instruments, and then they started making jackets and pants for the musicians that were coming in, you know, leather for the drums, leather for the jackets, leather for the pants. It was a very intuitive process for designing, so that in the way the small shops of the 30s were often reflective of the small shops of the 70s. Now, I've had the pleasure of hanging out with Robert Warner, who would be the whip stitcher of North Beach Leather. I know Michael Paradis, who was like a third owner. I've met some of the people in the 60s and 70s who worked in these shops, and there were notorious brands. But I just gonna show you, interestingly, that the shape and the design, this coat here, this is an East West Musical Instruments coat, okay? But if you look at the way it's constructed, and this one is linerless, they were very, very sort of naked leathery, and they had these beautiful hides that they selected back then in bison and cow. But if you look at the shape of this, and this is a man's coat, if you look at the shape of it, it's not all that dissimilar from the Northlander. You've got this sort of very motorcycle-y structured sleeve shape, and you've got this sort of intuitively coming in and going out 3/4 length body shape. The side adjusters are instead a lace up on the side, and then they just sort of constructed the front panels out of separate little pieces, which is the beautiful add-on of the 70s, is that in the 30s you'll get leather jacket companies that also sort of constructed these crazy sort of front plackets and such. And in my intuitive thought was that they were recycling smaller leather pieces to create like interesting sort of deco-esque shapes. And then you see in the 70s the same sort of intuitive design using small pieces, creating a sort of tight-fitting, sort of very elegant deco-esque style of coat. So in a way, and I'll just show you the East-West jacket. In a way, the Northlander is both a unique button front sort of version of those 70s jackets, or maybe like a precursor, if you will, in shape and style. This one looks a little less elegant because it's my size, but I will show you some more examples of vintage hippie leather, and you'll see what I mean by intuitive and deco-esque shape and style and pattern making. This is another good example of an East-West jacket, and you can see how beautifully cut the pieces are. So no liner, just very, very clean, beautiful pieces, but multi-paneled and very sort of intuitive to create that shape. This would have been a very attractive lady in the 70s, hippie rock star, would have worn this sort of shape with like almost like a motorcycle collar, and then this like crazy decorative flower done in leather work. There's a lot of customization in these hippie jackets, but not really all that dissimilar from what we try to do here at Himel Brothers, just with a little less, we're a little less decorative in our process, but like a really great shape, a really great a series of construction techniques, a little bit primitive, and a very similar, if you see the leather, you'll see a very similar set of characteristics in the leather. Our aniline steer hide here has very similar characteristics both in sound and feel to the East-West leather. So that would be an example of when I selected that steer hide. I was looking for a very similar top grain feel and characteristic, and I'll take some close-ups of that after. I'll just give you a couple more examples of that intuitive pattern making style. This is a softer leather North Beach late 60s, early 70s whip stitch pant, and as you can see, it almost has like an early 1890s indigenous design, essentially. So, this would have been essentially how, North American indigenous peoples might have designed a leather pant. I've seen original versions; they're not that dissimilar. Just very basic, front panel, back panel, whip stitching, and no sewing in this case. This is whip stitched together with leather thong, and you can see it forms a really sexy shape. And in this case, this intuitive shape works because the leather has a lot of stretch to it. So this is another example of picking the right material for the right garment. With a very simple shape, a very uncomplicated pattern, you just make it tight and make sure the leather has some stretch, and this will form around whomever's wearing it. So that is another example of making sure that the form and the function and the selection of leather works. This is a deerskin version of those North Beach pants. Again, whip stitched. Again, very, very similar to early indigenous pants, and very similar to that sort of 30s intuitive pattern making style, right before clothing got standardized in World War II. And finally, we have M&H here, which was another great brand out of New Mexico. And you have that great, again, it's whip stitched, and that great, very masculine, intuitive pattern making shape, right? So 30s jackets, very form fitting, very intuitive, very interesting primitive pattern making techniques. I can certainly go into that in motorcycle jackets from my collection, and you certainly see that in my Avro with its sort of organic curves, and you certainly see that in the original leather togs. And when we do designs here, we try to bring in all those elements in building both the pattern, which is different, and the design. Pattern and design. You can't just copy a design. You have to be an expert in the pattern. And that's why our jackets fit great. So Northlander, very, very cool, very classic design, very well fitting, very well structured. Thanks for looking at the video. Thanks for being a tribe member, Himel Bros. Follow us, like us, follow our social media.